Order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 4th of December 2024. Today, we're starting the evidence sessions on our inquiry about cash acceptance in the UK. This is something that's an interesting issue for the committee. During COVID, we saw the use of cash decrease, but we're increasingly seeing businesses that do not accept cash in other parts of society as well. So today we're hearing from users or representatives of users of cash, people who may need to use cash more than others. And I'm really delighted to welcome our witnesses. So from my left to right, we have Wayne Crocker, who's the director of Mencap Wales. I can't pronounce, well, tell me in Welsh. Cymru. I would say Cymru, but I'm never quite sure I get the accent, get it right. So from Mencap Cymru, he's joined by Deidre Cartwright, who's the Public Affairs and Policy Manager at Surviving Economic Abuse, and we'll hear from her why there's a specific issue there from her shortly. Chris Brooks is the Head of Policy at Age UK. We have Conor, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. And finally, but not finally, we have Delnevo, who's the Chair of the Payment Choice Alliance. So we've got a lot of witnesses. What I would say to each of you is if someone says something you agree with, you can just agree with them. You don't have to repeat it. And we will take that. And I just wanted to start really with a quick opener to all of you. Do you think that policymakers, so we're going to be making recommendations to government and others, do you think that they have a really clear understanding of the issues about when cash is not accepted in certain environments of business and elsewhere? And I think I'll start from my left to right on this occasion. Start with you,
So
Mr.
it's
Crocker.
easy no. I think not just policymakers. I think most people don't realise how important access to services and goods are using cash. So I think, certainly for my case, I'm someone that taps and goes and actually doesn't really think much about cash until I went to visit somebody that we supported who told us about the fact that they couldn't buy something with cash, and that made me quite curious around whether this was happening across Wales. So I think most people don't understand the challenges that people face if they don't
And what
use
more
cards.
do you think could be done to make people understand?
I think there are a few things that we need to do. I think certainly in terms of people with a learning disability, the organisations that support them, their families need to have better information around how they can support people to access services when they don't have access to credit or debit cards. There are real concerns around the fact that lots of statutory agencies, especially in Wales that we deal with, are moving to cashless. So organisations that may be funded through local government or Welsh government are moving to refusing cash payments, which makes another barrier for people with a learning disability.
Okay, and same questions to you, Ms. Cartwright.
Thank you very much. No, I don't think they have a full understanding of individuals' needs to access cash, particularly vulnerable individuals, in particular victims and survivors of economic abuse and domestic abuse more widely, are dependent on cash for their safety and for their survival. And we know this because victim survivors' access to a bank account is controlled, and oftentimes access to cash is their only means to actually accessing essentials for themselves and their children. It's a means for them to be able to escape an abuser, especially when that abuser can track them through a bank account. So it's incredibly important for their safety and survival. And I think what people also don't know is how vastly prevalent this is. It's not just a small subset of people who are affected by this. We released findings just that last week that showed 4.1 million women in the UK have experienced a partner or ex-partner controlling their access to money and economic resources. So this definitely isn't a small issue. Many women need access to cash.
Great, well, thank you for that. Mr. Brooks.
Thanks. I agree. I don't think that there's a full understanding of cash access needs. Among older people, it's often quite linked to digital inclusion. So there's still a couple of million pensioners who don't use the internet at all, and many more who lack the skills to use it proficiently. And managing your money online is really challenging for a lot of people. It's at the high end of the risk spectrum, and it can be really difficult for people to develop the skills to do that. And in fact, many people simply aren't ever going to develop the skills, no matter how much we try to give them education and training and give them the opportunity to do that. So cash will remain extremely important for a large number of people. It's not just linked to age, so it's more prevalent among the older age groups, say in the 85 plus age group, but it's also true among older people, and indeed it's true among younger people in our society as well. It's very closely linked to income, I think, is probably the biggest driver. So people on a lower income are often much more dependent on physical banking services and using cash on a day-to-day basis than people on higher incomes. And there are other factors that affect it as well. But I think that it's not an issue that's going to go away. So although it's probably more prevalent among the current cohort of older people, in future generations as well will be equally affected.
Thank you. Mr. Darcy.
I'll agree with the previous speakers as well. From the point of view of people with mental health problems, I think, again, it comes down to, there's been great strides in recent years about how people understand mental health problems. There's much more openness and conversation about it. But I think there's still some work to be done on understanding how mental health problems affect us practically. So that's things like memory, like making decisions, like staying on top of accounts and budgeting and all those sorts of things. And when we speak to people with mental health problems, it's often for those very reasons that people really rely on cash often. So it means that it is easier to make sure that you don't overspend. And for some conditions in particular, that's really important, particularly for people with bipolar, say. Overspending is a big risk, and we've heard some really sad stories of how people have gone from having a decent pot of savings or in a good financial position to spending huge amounts of money in a very short time. And while cash isn't the solution for every single problem, it's not that every single person with a mental health problem relies on cash. For some people, it can be a really useful tool to help them stay in control.
I agree with the other speakers. I think when we were putting our submission to this committee together, we were asked to look at special groups that might be impacted, and to be honest, I had to call a halt to that because there were so many groups impacted by this. And when you add all those groups together, it explains some of the statistics that we're getting in a more general way. Link, the ATM scheme, for the first time, as far as an official body was concerned, asked the question of the public recently, do you want to continue to use cash? It had always been focused on need. 81% said they wanted to have the option to continue to use cash. And when the Payment Choice Alliance surveyed through YouGov last year, 71% of adults said they wanted a law put in place to compel businesses to accept their cash. So this isn't a fringe issue, although there are many groups that do need special consideration. This is the general will of the British public, and I don't think that's fully understood.
Could you tell the committee if there were particular areas that people wanted to use cash for, if you could unpack that 81%?
Well, I think obviously public services. So we're getting a terrible situation now that hundreds of leisure centres around the country, which are owned by local authorities but operated by, ironically, two charities, are cashless. I've actually complained to the Charities Committee commissioners about this, but that's just one example. We've got transport where you cannot buy anything on most trains to eat now because they've gone cashless. There was a move towards station car parks going cashless, but I think the government may have halted that. There's also all of these facilities, the car parking around the country at public facilities, universities going cashless, football clubs going cashless.
People raised a lot of different areas where they...
Massive, yeah, and all around the country. It's stronger in London, I have to say, in the South East, but it's becoming a real problem around the country.
Yeah, we thought it was interesting to see from the evidence of the surveys that have happened about the regional disparities, which we'll come to. I want to turn to you, if I may, Mr. Crocker, about people with learning disabilities. And I think it would be helpful if the committee and anyone tuning in could understand why people with learning disabilities may relate differently to cash compared with digital payments, and why one might be more useful or different than the other.
Yes, I guess there are two main reasons. Firstly, there will be a significant number of people with who are under financial appointees, so that actually they don't control their own money. Those financial appointees might give them access to cash, their cash via an ATM card, so actually they don't have access to a credit or debit card because of their either capacity or they've been victims of financial abuse. So essentially they're given a cash point and they can take out a small amount of money every few days. There will also be people with who, even if they have a credit or debit card, they don't know how to use that. So we gave evidence to the Petitions Committee in the Senedd about a year ago now, as they were doing their inquiry, and one parent talked about the fact that she has two sons, both of whom have a learning disability, one of whom will fight you to the ground if you try to take £20 off him. The other, and she said, but you could ask him for his card and he'll give you his card and his PIN number, because it means nothing to him. But physical cash is very important to him. He understands the value of physical cash, and what we're finding is certainly people who are living in supported living, their support workers, rightly so, aren't able to use their own debit or credit cards to pay for things if people go into venues which are cashless. Also interesting, and the point about the universities are really important one. Lots of universities are places where people with learning will go and access activities, whether that's a theatre, because lots of universities have theatres attached to them, or conference facilities. So there are a number of universities in Wales where there are theatre groups specifically for people with a learning disability, which are based at those venues, and those venues don't accept cash. So you have people going there for the whole day and not able to buy anything because they don't have a credit or debit card. They only have cash and they can't purchase anything.
Okay, and we've had some quite interesting evidence about the impact on people. One case where somebody turned up to pay, was told they couldn't pay with a card, and the police had to be called.
He had a meltdown. So he's been buying the same magazine from this shop for many, many years, and then the shop had moved to cashless. So he'd gone there, he hadn't understood this, tried to pay, they said they couldn't accept it, and then he had a meltdown and was removed by the police. But you know, one of the challenges, I guess, if you're in a high street and there are cafes, some cafes may decide not to accept cash. You have a choice there, but there are lots of venues where you don't. So often a theatre will be the only theatre in a town. So if they decide to move to cashless, you don't have a choice to go somewhere else. You don't have a choice to go to a theatre, you know, two doors down the road, down the street, to use that theatre, which you can do in certain places like cafes. And that's our real concern, is that the sort of places that people with a disability go to feel part of their communities, they're being excluded from those venues.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's, the evidence that came written in was very, very helpful in this respect. Is there anything that you think businesses could do to make life easier for people with learning difficulties, other than accepting cash? I mean, if they, advertising differently, perhaps.
I think we need to certainly look to that system where maybe there's some sort of sign on the door so people know that they can pay cash if they go in there. But what you also need is local campaigning.
Not everyone with a learning disability would be able to read or understand that sign.
I think people can be taught that will be, because often if you're depending on what level of impairment you have, you'll have support staff with you. The problem is support staff could go to a shop with you, but they're not allowed to use their own card. So actually, if you go into a shop and that shop is cashless, that person can't buy anything or purchase any services. So they can be supported to understand, well, this venue will accept cash. The real challenge for me, though, is that there are organisations receiving government funding, whether that's through the local authority or through Welsh Government, for us, obviously, in Wales, who are being allowed to exclude people by not accepting cash.
Thank you very much indeed. Lola McAvoy, MP.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your evidence so far. So my question is just moving slightly on to older people. So for Chris, Mr. Brooks, if that's all right. So I personally think the use of cash is very important culturally to the older generation. I think it's about a big level of control at a time when illness or increasing disability might lead to isolation. I think many older people are really scared of the online scams that are out there at the moment, and I just wondered if you could outline what challenges you think are facing older people in with access to cash, but also cash acceptance in general.
Yeah, sure. I think you've highlighted some very valid points there. I think what you said rings true. It's very difficult for a lot of people to move online and move to online ways of paying for goods. And so people will be reliant on cash. There's a significant challenge with scams. It's the biggest reason why people are fearful of going online, for sure. It's very difficult to help people overcome that as well. The introduction of the code around APP scams is helpful, although I think it's a shame it's been watered down a bit at the last minute, because a lot of the time it's about confidence, and so it's just the enabling factor is that if people have got some support to help them, they're still very reluctant to do it, and so it can be very difficult to break down that cycle. So if it's about building confidence, then we need to make sure that people are operating in a totally secure environment, and at the moment that's just not the case. There's just been a lack of attention, I think, given to that by industry and by the government. So partly driven by the first question about the lack of understanding among policymakers. It's very difficult to put yourself in someone's shoes when they're in that position. And many people know someone who have been who's been scammed, and so feel it very keenly, the fear. And many people would have been scammed themselves, and of course older people are often targeted as well. That certainly is very difficult. I think you're also right about the cultural factors. It's quite clear that the cohort of older people at the moment, particularly the oldest sort of the 80, 85 pluses, have grown up in a world where they've used cash all the time for everything, and it's very difficult to change. People simply trust cash, so it's a matter of trust. It's difficult to draw a precise distinction, but perhaps if I can speculate a bit, I think there's a line between people who use technology and computers a lot in their working lives, who are maybe a bit more familiar with computers. And that's not a binary divide between pensioners and non-pensioners by any means. There are still lots of people in their 50s, even younger, who don't really use IT and who will struggle with that kind of thing. So it's not an issue that's going to go away. But I think you're right that there's a clear... there are a lot of older people who do struggle with online payments, and so we're very reliant on cash. And when they can't pay with cash, it hits them very keenly. It's very difficult for people if you've been going to a shop for many, many years and suddenly you find you're no longer able to pay in the means that you want to pay with. And particularly when it comes to essential goods and services, which is where I get very concerned. And I think there's potentially a distinction here between people selling maybe higher end, more expensive goods and people selling essential goods and services, so the things that people absolutely rely on to survive on a day-to-day basis. And that's when there's a real problem, and I think that's what particularly needs addressing, and we need to make sure that the decline in cash acceptance is arrested and that people can go about their day-to-day lives with the things that they need to do, which probably predominantly means things like purchasing groceries or clothing, but also leisure activities, so people can get out and about and take part in life as they wish in their communities. Otherwise, I think we're going to have a very real problem, which I think is why it's a very timely inquiry for the committee to be looking at.
And just to follow up on that point, you said about the essential goods and services. So in Darlington, my constituency is a proud market town, and I'm really interested in the cash element to market culture, because I think a lot of people would go down with a £10 note and be very, very keen to then get all of their groceries, and they might know their grocer, they might haggle a bit, they might negotiate a bit. It's quite culturally important. It's also an activity, something social for people to do. Do you think the removal of cash from our high streets is going to contribute to an isolation of older people, like the isolation problem that older people face?
I think it could contribute to it, yes, all other things being equal. I think there have been developments in recent years about other payment systems as well, so the cost for market traders of having a little contactless touch point thing has come down. So it's not that it's necessarily the be-all and end-all in that respect in regards to loneliness and isolation, but it's certainly a significant factor. And when you combine it with the trust and the long-term usage, I think it could create some difficulties for a substantial number of people.
Thank you. Rachel Blake MP.
Thanks very much. You started to talk a bit about possible practical solutions to this, and you started making the distinction between essential services and other types of services. I'm interested in this topic. I think the committee is interested in terms of practical solutions and our recommendations, but that clearly creates a challenge in terms of who decides what's essential and how might a government regulate for what is and isn't essential. So can you elaborate a bit more on your thinking about how you might draw on some of those distinctions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously at some point someone has to define what essential means, as you say, so it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. I would define it broadly as being something that has a significant impact on someone's day-to-day life. Which can include goods. I was thinking particularly of groceries and clothing, and there are probably other goods which I'm omitting. And also services, so enabling people to get out and about. So transport would be a key service, other leisure activities, potentially leisure centres, and other things that are provided by the public sector as well. I think that would be a good starting point, but I could imagine there'd be quite a lot of debate in formulating exactly what that looks like.
I think it's probably something we'd like to come on to with other witnesses, because there could be scenarios where you could create some quite challenging environments for the people having to accept. I wanted to come back to you a bit on the scams. You referred to the APP changes, saying that they were a bit watered down. Was that the movement from the 415,000 to the 85,000, or was it something else you were making reference to? I was interested in what you were saying.
Yeah, that was what I was alluding to. Yes, I think the flaw with the system potentially is probably more at the other end, though. So it's the excess, the £100 excess, which cuts out about 33% of fraud in the first place. So that is of concern, and hopefully, as it's embedded, the regulators will continue to look at it and make any changes as necessary.
Is there some evidence that you could share with us about the impact of the £100 excess on older people? I'm sure we'd be interested to.
Yeah, I can have a look and see what I've got.
Very good. Very much. Dame Harriet Baldwin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to probe a little bit more, if I may, on Chris Brooks's evidence. And in fact, you've all been really compelling about the types of people who will be excluded if they can't use cash. But specifically about the age distinction that you shared with us just now. I can understand older people who haven't necessarily been brought up in a cashless society, but children today are very much being brought up in cashless situations, and I just wondered how you justify the claim that you made that this will actually continue for generation after generation. Is this not something that will begin to seem archaic over time, because a lot of kids will never have seen anyone in their family use anything other but tapping?
Over 50% of pocket money is still paid in cash in this country. So those kids know what cash is.
Okay.
And of Gen Z, 17% of Gen Z still prefer to use cash. So I think there's obviously a lot of more mature people, older if you like, who prefer cash, but I think it's across generations. 16 million people budget using cash, and that's across generations.
Okay,
so
that's really interesting. And is that you concur with that evidence?
Yeah, I think if you look at the polling, there's still a number of people in younger age groups who are reliant on cash. It's a smaller number for sure than say the current cohort of older people, but it's still there. In terms of access to banking and access to digital services, the four factors which come out as being statistically significant based on our research are your age. So the older you are, the more likely you are to want to use physical banking services. It's whether you live with other people or not. So people are living alone are more reliant on physical banking. Gender, so women are more reliant. And low income, which is probably the most important one here. So it's very closely correlated with income. And I think that's probably the overriding thread between different generations more than the others.
Thank you, Chair. Very much, Dame Harriet. Bobby Dean, MP.
My question is to you, Deidre Cartwright. I was quite struck by what you said in the beginning there about 4.1 million people potentially being affected by having their access to money restricted by their partners. Just to begin with, for the record, could you just explain what economic abuse is, how widespread it is in this country, if there are any particular groups that are affected, and the role that cash plays in economic abuse?
Yeah, that's fine. So economic abuse is a form of domestic abuse as it's defined within the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. It's also a crime as a form of coercive and controlling behaviour, which very importantly was extended post-separation through the Domestic Abuse Act, really recognising that for many victim survivors of economic abuse, it can begin, continue and escalate post-separation, oftentimes because of the ties to the abuser through joint finances such as a mortgage or a bank account or dependence on child support. Economic abuse is all about someone's partner or ex-partner trying to control how they acquire, they use, and they maintain money and economic resources. They do this through a range of behaviours to exploit and sabotage and restrict their access to this. I think the important thing to remember about economic abuse is that it is perpetrated in a wider context of other abusive behaviours, such as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, so that there is a constant context of fear and isolation. So victim survivors are really negotiating their safety, their survival, the real threat of being killed by a partner or ex-partner, both during the relationship and when they are fleeing. For victims and survivors of economic abuse, a perpetrator controlling their access to a bank account is a significant way in which that abuser maintains control. So it might be that they say they can't access a bank account at all. They may be only able to access a joint bank account with the abuser. They may be monitoring how that victim survivor is spending every single penny through that joint bank account. We had one victim survivor share with us that the abuser wouldn't allow her access to a bank account at all, and instead would give her a cash budget that she was allowed to go and spend on a weekly budget. And as restrictive as that is, she at least had a degree of control over how she spent that money. Then when COVID hit and everything went contactless, she said, actually, this is even worse for me because he can scrutinize every single penny I save or spend. The other thing about economic abuse and reliance on cash is we know victim survivors will be secretly squirreling away cash for the moment that they are able to leave that abuser, knowing that the abuser can't track them through a joint bank account, but they can use that money in the moments and the days and the weeks after they leave to pay for transport, food, accommodation, just meeting their and their children's basic needs and ability to survive. For victims and survivors, leaving is when they're at the highest risk of harm and homicide. So making sure they have the money to leave is critical. And not having the money to leave can stop a victim survivor from being able to do that. And for some victim survivors, they don't even have the chance to plan. They are forced to leave with the clothes on their back, maybe a few pounds in their pockets. If they then go to the bus and they can't pay for it with cash, that's a huge implication for their safety.
And can you explain to me why it's significant that it has to be cash as opposed to concealing a separate bank account that you might be able to go create on yourself? We have lots of apps out there now. People can create bank accounts quite quickly. Potentially could conceal a debit card in the same way you could conceal cash. But can you tell me the differences that cash makes as opposed to bank?
We really shouldn't underestimate, the different ways that perpetrators coerce and control, and they will restrict a victim survivor's access to the means to even be able to open a bank account. So not being able to access the identification that you require. One victim survivor shared that her ex-husband had told the bank that she had left the country and that she couldn't have a bank account opened, so she couldn't open one. There are things that banks can do to ensure victim survivors can access a bank account when they do flee. And so, for instance, TSB has a flee fund, which is a one-off non-repayable cash payment to victim survivors to help them leave, but also it helps them to open an independent bank account and being more flexible in the identification that they require. But there are other groups of victim survivors who are disproportionately reliant on cash. So older victim survivors in particular who are reliant on cash for different reasons, but also migrant victim survivors without leave to remain, who often cannot open an independent bank account at all, so they're forced to share one with the abuser. And the abuser will use that to their advantage so that victim survivor cannot flee.
So just finally, what do you think the government can do to ensure that cash can remain this lifeline for victims?
I think regulating, acceptance of cash, monitoring how effective the provision of cash is, because victim survivors are equally reliant on the provision of cash as well as access to high street banks and ATMs, for money, but also for support. Many banks provide something called safe spaces, which is incredibly important for victim survivors. Also making sure any bank that a victim survivor goes to, they are all flexibly applying, the criteria that they have for opening a bank account. So it doesn't matter who you're banking with, you can access an independent bank account if you've been forced to flee an abuser. But also ensuring that victim survivors actually have the money to leave. So like I said, TSB has a flea fund, other banks do as well. The government piloted and then rolled out a national flea fund. It hasn't been confirmed whether or not that has been made permanent.
Could you just explain that?
So a flea fund is basically money that is distributed through frontline domestic abuse services to victims and survivors when they're forced to leave an abuser, so that they actually have the money to leave and then be able to begin to rebuild their lives.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Lola McAvoy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Cartwright, your evidence is harrowing and very compelling, and thank you for being so articulate in it. I know there'll be a lot of people watching who feel very moved by what you've said. It's my understanding that with domestic abuse, victims can often try and leave several times. From what you've said, it sounds as though access to cash and cash acceptance specifically on that journey when people are trying to leave could be a barrier to them getting a safe haven and actually successfully leaving an abusive partner. What do you think about that?
I think that's definitely true. I think there are many barriers to a victim survivor leaving. It's dangerous and it's life-threatening, and there's no guarantee that you will actually be able to access safety at the end. You may be turned away from accommodation, you may be turned away from support, but also little things like not even having the money to meet your children's basic needs will stop you, because you're operating with so many knowns when you're still in that relationship. You're managing so many different dangers and you know how to do it. You've done it for a long time. There's so many unknowns when you leave. Will I be able to feed my children? Will they have a roof over their head? I don't know. And that is what can stop you. If you don't have the cash to do that, that is just one more barrier to leaving.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms McAvoy. Mr Darcy, if I can come to you. You gave a good explanation at the beginning about some of the challenges for people with mental health problems. But could you perhaps just explain, for the record really, what might make a difference to the way someone's mental health situation means that they might need to use cash, or how it could be helpful compared with other forms of payment?
Sure. I think a lot of this comes back to the cycle of money and mental health problems that we talk about quite a lot, which is, I think most people can understand how, if you're struggling financially, that can have a big toll on your mental health, worrying how are you going to meet the next bill or put food on the table. I think we're also really interested in the other half of that cycle, which is how your mental health problems affect you practically. And I've spoken about some of those, but again, things like remembering to pay a bill on time, making sure that there's the right amount of money in an account, making decisions about which product to go for, some practical things about asking for help is always feels like the most ironic one, that when you need it most, it can be really hard to reach out if you're struggling with your mental health. And controlling spending and budgeting effectively is something that becomes much harder. And again, from speaking to people in our research community, which is a group of about 4,000 people who all have personal experience with mental health problems that most of what I'll draw on is based on, there's not just one reason for most people, and often it really does come down to income, as we were speaking about with older people. So people with mental health problems are really overrepresented in those in lower income groups. They make up about half of people in problem debt. So lots of people are in this financially precarious situation, and cash for lots of people functions as a really important safeguard, a really important tool to help them navigate through that. So I think there's a few different reasons. So one is just controlling spending. I talked about people with bipolar disorder and how they can, again, go through large amounts of money in short periods of time. We've also heard from people with a whole range of other conditions, things like depression, where people just notice that their spending goes up quite a bit when they're unwell. And with cash, you just get a little bit of an extra limit on that versus cards, where you can spend a lot more money in a short period of time. I think there's something on budgeting that feels really important, where people tell us a lot that you can spend on cards, and lots of people we speak to are not totally averse to using cards ever, but when you're in that period where your finances are in a tricky position and your mental health isn't great, anything that helps you to stay on top and really make your financial situation as manageable as possible feels really important. So people often tell us that cash feels more real and that spending feels more real when they're going through that poor period of mental health than on a card, particularly when you can just tap when the transaction might not show up straight away on your app, and you can just really lose track very quickly of how much you've spent. And that means, you know, people on quite tight budgets can blow their budget early on in the week and be left in a really difficult position. I think there's something on getting help from friends and family, where another really common symptom is, or a common experience is, that people struggle to leave the house when their mental health isn't great, and it might be for anxiety or depression or a whole range of other reasons. And being able to trust someone to, you know, get some shopping in for you is really important. And there's risks here both to the individual. Obviously, if you are handing over a card with no limits built in, that means that you could lose huge amounts of money. There's a risk for the carer or the friend or the family member as well, and how much risk they're taking on of having that card, and misunderstandings or whatever it might be. And cash is then another way that, you know, you're giving someone £20 or £50, and it gives you that little bit of extra control over your situation. I think to the point around older people, scams is something that comes up a lot in our research as well. Some polling we did a few years ago found that people with mental health problems were about 3 times more likely to have been scammed online than the rest of the population. And for some people, they bounce back and they continue, but for other people, they withdraw and really worry about every single transaction, every single bit of spending, what might happen if they use their card, the risk.
Are you saying that a scam would just discourage people from going online? Because, I mean, having more cash available in retail outlets and cafes wouldn't necessarily stop people going online as well. Are you saying that the scamming just makes them more nervous about not using cash?
Makes them more keen to use cash,
yeah.
because I think the risk of, you know, the people's card being stolen, those kind of things, it means that if you're working in cash, there's obviously risks to using cash as well, but people feel they're more understood and it's more controllable, rather than the entire contents of your bank account potentially being taken away.
Do you? I mean, if so, in gambling, you can have limits set on how much you use. Do you think that there could be any scope for helping in this situation by actually having limits on what could be spent? Because some of what you're talking about would be difficult to do in cash anyway. If you're shopping online, you know, and some of those would not translate to cash transactions because that shop's not on your high street, for example. So you wouldn't have the option anyway because it's physically not present. So is there any other way that you would think we're talking mainly about use of cash, but are there any other alternatives?
Yeah, I think we see lots of practice from banks that's really encouraging. So I think gambling blocks is a really good example where you can protect yourself in advance. If you know that you struggle with certain kinds of spending or certain kinds of periods in your life, that can be really useful. There's things like carers cards or companion cards, trusted person cards that remove some of that risk that I was just talking about of sharing, giving your card to someone else. There's things around like pots and limits and notifications about here's how much you've spent, so it is easier for people to keep track even when their mental health isn't great. So I think there is lots that can be done and that we've seen. I think some of the concerns around that are they haven't been widely taken up. So some of it's around, you know, a number of banks have tried these things, but how well they've been advertised, how well they're understood, I think is still a big concern. And when we speak to people, I think there's a real reluctance after, you know, I've got a system that works for me. This has been working well, helping me manage my mental health for 20 years, and I'm having to take a risk by trying this new product that I don't know what it's going to be like at the moment when my mental health isn't great. So it really feels like a concern there for some people. And I guess it's the trade-off of acknowledging some of the points around, you know, younger people definitely will still be interested in cash and still value it. I think the pace at which cash is going away versus the pace at which these really good, useful solutions are following up, I think the latter isn't quite keeping pace, and there's that risk that people get caught in the middle where there aren't those innovations to really help them to navigate around.
Is there any bank or banking group that you would say is doing a particularly good job on this?
I think there's a handful. I mean, I think Lloyds and NatWest, I think, are some of the ones that have carers cards or companion cards. I'm sure there's others that I'm forgetting. Those gambling blocks are pretty widespread across the sector, and I think that's an example that we always find really encouraging, because it was something that, you know, when we started back in 2016, didn't really exist, and it went in a relatively short period of time from being this very new advanced product to something that is now just standard across most providers.
In terms of actual, you know, so if people go out and for whatever reason with their mental health situation wants to be using cash, is there anything that you think that businesses should be doing differently or better to understand the impact of their acceptance or not of cash on people's mental health?
Yeah, I think, so like practically some of the things we spoke about earlier of having really clear signage and making it obvious, making it clear online so that people aren't going to a shop and then getting to the till, having a full trolley of goods and then having to not be able to pay. And we've heard some really difficult stories of people who that's happened to, and really emphasising the level of anxiety that people are having to overcome, firstly, to even actually get out the door sometimes, and then to experience that when you've built yourself up. People have told us it's just knocked them back massively and meant they couldn't do anything. So being really clear about whether or not cash is accepted, I think, is important. Accepting it where they can feels really important as well. And just from the point of view of, we work a lot with essential services firms, like in utilities, for instance, and so financial services, and we're always really keen on them doing research with their customers who have mental health problems to understand, here are the actual things that I'm going through, here's what I would actually like to see in place. So we're always very keen to see that.
And do you think that there should be any legislation or changes in guidance from government about about this particular issue? I mean, we'll come to other witnesses, will answer it in their turn, but on for people with mental health problems. We talk about mental health first aid, we talk about more mental health awareness. Certainly things have changed in my time in Parliament, but what do you think, is there anything you think government could or should be doing in this area?
I think on the tools and solutions for financial services, I think sessions like this and the attention that your committee can give to this as a bit of a kick to that sector to really push out these products more, to understand.
You think it's the sector rather than government? I'm just being clear. So well, you think the sector should be doing it? You don't think government needs to?
I think that's part of the solution. Yeah. I think to go back to some of those really essential services, I guess to add to the list that Mr. Brooks mentioned earlier, around paying for utilities is a really big one, that you can actually pay for an energy bill in cash. Feels like a big additional one. It's those services where there aren't alternatives, where not being able to use them just risks excluding people in a massive way. That feels like where there might be a gap in the legislation.
Thank you very much indeed. Dame Siobhan McDonald, MP.
We've been talking about access to cash and using cash for quite a few years now, and what seems to precipitate it is reports kind of in the media, particularly at the BBC, about the increasing numbers of people using cash in order to help them budget their way through the cost of living crisis. And I just wanted to ask, in your experience and all your agencies, how widespread is the use of cash as a budgeting tool?
Where do you want to start?
I'll start with Mr. Crocker.
Yeah, okay. So I guess what's interesting is, so we spoke to some charities who run appointees for people with a learning plan. They said that 10% of the people they work with will only use cash because they don't have access to any other type of banking account that will allow them credit or debit facilities to be able to pay for things by those cards. You've got 10% who have no choice. You then have a larger group of people who actually, even if they have access to a card, they don't use the card because the ability to budget with cash is vital to them, whether it's budgeting in terms of what they do for their day-to-day spending, or actually understanding how money works for them. That access to cash is vital. So I think there's a bit of confusion, because whilst the campaign and lots of the language has been around people having access to cash. Well, you can have access to cash, you can have free ATM access, but if you can't use that cash, having access to cash is pointless. So you have to have the ability to have the spaces where you can spend that cash. And I think one of the, coming back to one of the questions earlier around what government could do, the access to cash has to be seen through the lens of the Equality Act. And actually, we wouldn't allow people to, venues to not allow disabled people who say, wheelchair users to access their venues. But we'll allow venues to say that you can exclude people because you're not going to accept cash. So I would challenge government around how does it use the Equality Act to ensure that people who have to have access to venues through cash can still carry on doing that.
Yeah, I would say that victims and survivors of economic abuse are definitely dependent on cash for budgeting purposes. So 9 out of 10 victim survivors, when they leave an abuser, do have a negative budget or less than £100 at the end of each month. So being able to have cash to be able to budget with is incredibly important to them. On average, victim survivors also have £24,000 of debts as a direct result of the economic abuse they're experiencing. So really it is important for them to be able to manage their money through cash.
And their need for anonymity as well, don't they? And to shield what they're spending on.
Definitely, yeah.
Mr. Brooks.
So 13% of 65 to 74-year-olds and 17% of 75 pluses like using cash as a way of controlling their spending. And that's broadly consistent across all age groups, actually. So it's not It's neither more or less prevalent among older people. It's certainly something I think is a very important reason for maintaining cash, particularly among people on lower incomes. And there are still a number of older people who use the payment exception service that the DWP runs, which means that they can collect their state pension in cash if they don't have a bank account. And we've seen obviously the end of post office card accounts in recent years, which many people use, but there are still quite a lot of people who are unbanked and collect their cash and then go and obviously spend their cash. And so it is really important for that group in particular that they can maintain a way that works for them of managing their money.
Do you have just a figure for how that's changed over the years, that group, that cohort?
Not
but if you have it.
Well, I can go back. It's from the FCA, that figure.
Right.
I can go back and
we
look
can
at
ask Nicole next week.
Okay. Mr. Darcy.
Right. I know that the FCA stats include for poor health as well, and that can bring out for mental health problems. When we've done surveys with people on this, roughly around 40% of people regularly use cash and like using it. And when we've asked them what are the reasons behind that, the two that always come top are budgeting and to control spending. And it's often in those situations, like with the cost of living, people are really hard pushed and are just about getting by. So anything they can do to have that extra control is really important.
Yes, I would just echo what everybody else has said here, that I used to be a trustee of a Citizens Advice Bureau, and we had youngsters coming in there saying, how do we switch off contactless? Because we're just waiving these things and we don't realise what we're spending. Whereas if you take £20 out for an evening and it's gone, you spent your £20. So it covers a wide variety of people who are seeking more control over their lives. And the thing is that they know now that if they don't get control at the end of the month when the bill's got to be paid, they have a very unhappy life. So this is about not just paying for things, it's about your whole life and your attitude towards life, how positive you feel. And I'd also echo the thing about, we've had some heartrending stories from people who've got relatives with disabilities, and when they don't get their cash accepted, they feel that it's robbing them of self-esteem. This was their money and they had the right to spend it, and they're being told your money is no good anymore, and they take that as implying that they're no good anymore, and that's a very negative thing. And why should they be robbed of self-esteem because some businesses think it's convenient to turn down cash?
UK's Finance's most recent payments market report found that for some people, digital budgeting tools are supplanting cash budgeting. Are there any barriers preventing some sections of society from being able to take up these tools? Are financially vulnerable people who rely on cash to budget experience the inequality in access to goods and services because of changes in cash acceptance?
Well, one thing to say is over 8 million people in this country don't have smartphones. So already you're seeing a limit on their ability to participate. And by the way, the statistic doesn't tell the whole story. I was doing a launch of a fintech in Stoke, actually, and we found, many people had smartphones, but they were the wrong type of smartphone because they were actually Chinese smartphones, which were not able to download certain apps because of the row with security issues and so on. So about 50% had cheaper smartphones, and by the way, you need cheaper smartphones because Apple are now charging nearly £1,000. But they couldn't use them for certain things because those phones weren't capable of getting all the apps down from the App Store. So, the participation is vital. There are many people who can't actually use things, not just because they haven't got the skills, but they can't afford the passport to participate. They can't afford £1,000 for a smartphone.
Darcy?
I think when it comes to people with mental health problems, I mentioned before that they can be, these sorts of tools can be really useful. I think there's something about that risk of taking on something when you've got a system, you feel like it's working for you. The risks of it going wrong are really high because it means your whole budget could get thrown off, and actually knowing that cash is going to work for you is important. But for the tools that do work, I think it's making sure that they're really easy to find, that people get told about them, that people explain how to use them practically rather than just saying, here's a tool, use it, and expecting people to use it, because there is such uncertainty, there's such fear, I think, often about what will happen if it goes wrong, or some of the risks and how to make the most of it, I suppose. And I think there's something about how when someone's mental health isn't great, that again, like, does it lock them into certain behaviours, or does it protect them from certain things? Explaining that really clearly in advance so people know this is something that's going to kick in when my mental health isn't great in a way that I really want, but isn't going to limit me from being able to transact the way I want and buy the things I want when I'm in a good mental position.
So I don't want to repeat myself about digital exclusion, but obviously if you're not online, then digital tools aren't going to be much help to you. There's a significant minority of older people who aren't online. But for many people, they might be very helpful. But I think that there's a point about human nature there as well, that it's very difficult to engage people with those type of tools anyway. So they will be very helpful to some people, but not for everybody. And trying to make them apply more widely is a challenge, I think.
Ms. Cartwright. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I think as important as it is that victim survivors should be able to access cash for their safety and survival, I think we shouldn't just assume and accept that they should be digitally excluded as a result of that. And I think we need to think about that, at the product design phase. How are we designing products that aren't being easily controlled and manipulated by abusers? We should have these vulnerable customers in mind. The consumer duty and the vulnerability guidance that sits alongside it clearly names economic control as a life event that causes vulnerability. So they should be thinking about it so that victim survivors aren't just excluded and therefore dependent on cash.
So I was just going to say, so I've worked with people with a little for just over 30 years. I've never met somebody that uses online, uses these apps to manage their bank accounts. And often you'll hear from families who try to support their loved ones to access their bank account using the telephone, that if they're prompting them with the security words, the person on the other end hears somebody talking to them, believes they're being coerced, and then ends that conversation. So actually there's very little ability that family members who support their loved ones have to be able to help them access their accounts.
And I don't want to stray on to another section, but I was particularly taken by something that you said, Mr. Delnevo, about council sports and swimming pool facilities that simply don't take cash, when some of the groups of people that you represent and care for are those who need access to that sort of ability to exercise and feel good about themselves is even greater than for most other people.
Absolutely, and it also points, this idea that you can have a two-speed society where some businesses might be compelled to accept cash and some businesses not. If you look at a leisure centres have cafes, so you can insist, or you can pay for your swim, but if you don't insist that the cafe accepts cash, you can't have the social event afterwards. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to assume that certain things should be left out. One of the reasons we didn't include Ireland as an example of international precedence was that the Irish government's looking at limiting cash, compelling cash acceptance to certain businesses. And a government minister was very struck, an Irish government minister was doing a radio interview, and he said, "Oh no, we're not going to cover things like just having a cup of coffee." And I was thinking, there's millions of people who think that going out and having a cup of coffee and socialising is very important. And if we allow businesses, many businesses would here if a law is brought in, but if we allow them to have easy escapes like, oh no, this doesn't have to do it because this is a part of our business that doesn't have to accept cash under the law, we're going to end up with lots of arguments that we don't need actually. If you simply make it a rule, cash must be accepted, then all the businesses must do it and they can't argue about it.
My final question, should the government legislate, regulate or issue guidance?
Legislate for me, as many governments have. I mean, we are actually outliers. The French government have legislated, the Spanish government have legislated, the Slovakian government, the Norwegian government. In America, 8 states have legislated, and they enforce it. In America, an ice cream parlour, although a chain, not just one, they said, oh no, we're not going to accept cash. They had fines in the end of over $100,000 for not accepting them, and believe it or not, now they accept cash. So the fact is that if you don't have legislation, there will be some businesses that try to sneak out of it, and that places more weight on the businesses who continue to be faithful to cash, because cash then becomes more expensive for them. So I don't think any business should be allowed to dodge its responsibility here. And to be fair, many very honourable businesses around this country are saying we are never going to stop accepting cash. But there's a slide towards businesses becoming cashless, and as we've said, especially businesses which are, or organisations which are funded by public money, that cannot be acceptable.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On the point of leisure centres, Chair, if I may observe, I went to a council leisure centre once which wouldn't take cash but did insist that you had a £1 coin for the locker.
Indeed. You, Anne Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I want to broaden out the point beyond leisure centres to public services, more generally including services subcontracted by local authorities. Mr. Delnevo, could you give a broad overview of the changes in cash acceptance in this sector and in particular parts of it over the last decade or so?
Well, bear in mind that this whole thing only started about 12 years ago. Before Uber came to this country and started offering cashless taxi services, and we had the Olympic Games in 2012, which Visa tried to make cashless. They didn't succeed in doing that. Nobody mentioned cashless around this country. Cashless didn't exist for in-person purchases. But what's been happening is, and partly as a result of the pandemic, when there were some false health scares that went around about cash, there's been this creeping thing that's crept into car parking now. So I know some older friends who stopped going to certain places like Bromley in Kent to shop because they couldn't park without having an app. And they don't have apps, they don't have smartphones. And so we've seen parking massively affected. We've seen on-train catering, you can't buy food on trains. We've seen universities, we've seen leisure facilities, we've mentioned all these leisure facilities. Theatres, you know, like the Ambassador Theatre Group have gone cashless. And many of these organisations are supported by the government or local authorities. And that seems wrong, that the general funding of the government or local authorities, which they get from everybody, should actually be used to subsidise businesses which are not allowing everybody locally to use cash. It also affects tourists, by the way, because in most countries in the world, there's no question of cash being accepted. They come to this country, and we've had lots of tourists saying, we got all our foreign currency, our pounds, and we can't use it because, you know, so many businesses, particularly in London, are not accepting cash anymore. How is that good for the reputation of Britain that cash isn't accepted?
Thank you, Mr. Delnevo. I want to pick up on the point that you made about car parking. Car parking is an issue that comes up frequently on the doorstep in Early and Woodley constituency. And the Oracle Shopping Centre in the centre of Reading is a cashless car park, for example. I was wondering if you or anyone on the panel has had these conversations with car park operators about the pros and cons of their switch to cashlessness, and if you've gotten any kind of response from them. So
yes, we have. I mean, we've been, well, we contacted the railway companies because they were thinking of going cashless, but we also contacted the government at the same time, and the government stepped in and asked them to think again about making station car parks cashless, and the government since assured us that they will not allow that to happen for station car parks. For shopping centres, we've been in touch with one of the biggest operators, NCP, but we've had no response to date because they don't think that they've got a social responsibility. And there's a really ironic thing. One of our supporters persuaded the Imperial War Museum in Manchester to accept cash again, but the car park's operated by NCP and doesn't accept cash. So people who come in there who don't have other means to pay are having to drive in and drive out again, and there's nowhere else to park. So, you know, there isn't sufficient consideration given here. They're thinking that they can just ignore the will of the British people, and this has got to stop.
Anyone else? I just want anyone of the other witnesses on that point, and then I'll bring these.
I mean, I haven't had any conversations with car park operators, but I agree that it's the issue that I hear about the most. We hear from older people all the time who are very frustrated about the trip out that they can't make by car because they discover they can't pay for parking. And I think 33% of older people don't use a smartphone, so it's cutting out a huge proportion of the population, and it's a really serious issue.
Follow up from
sorry. Just more broadly, not necessarily on car parking, but we're talking about Mr. Delnevo. Sorry.
That's all right. When Ron will be fine.
Thank
you.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. You mentioned a lot about the social exclusion that's happening as a result of these changes, do you think it's an oversight by companies and by organisations in the round because of the pandemic, where people were sort of encouraged more to use contactless payment, and actually by having these conversations now in the open, most organisations would agree with you? I mean, your evidence is very compelling. I'm just interested in how you feel, whether it's intention or design, that people are being excluded.
I think the move towards cashless has been quite intentional. You had the debate about assisted dying last week in Parliament, and the assisted death of cash has been going on for quite a long time in this country. Withdrawal of bank services, withdrawal of ATMs, and now the reduction in acceptance. We have to remember that one of the biggest card companies in the world, MasterCard, declared war on cash in 2010. They wanted to see cash disappear entirely. They haven't succeeded, thank goodness, but that's what they intended. So I don't think we should say it's an oversight. I think many responsible businesses that might have brought in measures to start with during the pandemic, like, say, Greggs the Bakers, for example, they quickly retrenched and said, no, we're going back to accepting cash in all our branches because we understand our customers want and need. But there are other businesses like Gales, the bakery company, they made the excuse of the pandemic, and since they've just continued not to accept
You would
cash.
need quite a lot of cash to go to Gales, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Too much for the product, some would say. So that's true, but once again, we're back to the want thing. People who are affluent often want to use cash, and why should they be stopped from using it? But you could argue just stop using Gales, which may be unfortunate for Gales.
Let's not get into it.
But you know, there's also the question of not thinking sufficiently through it. We've been in touch with Marks and Spencers. Marks and Spencers do accept cash, but they don't often make that clear in some of their cafes and so on. And we've said to them, why don't you install signs saying cash is welcome? Because you'll have signs saying Visa's welcome and MasterCard. Oh, we're not prepared to do that. And that's causing confusion amongst customers. And confusion means that people feel wary about even offering to pay because they're frightened it will get turned down. And you either walk away or you push it. And most people won't push it, they walk away. So we need clearer signage. And I think you mentioned that earlier too. Where cash is accepted, it should be clear, and where it's not accepted, it should be clear too.
Just quickly on this point, I need to go back to Ms Yang. Yeah, but Rachel.
It's on energy costs. Shall I go now?
No, Ms Yang.
I just want to go back to the point about local authorities and their subcontracted services. Now, I was wondering if in the panel's dialogues with local authorities, you've ever had the point made back to you that it's a resource issue for local authorities to accept cash, or for their subcontracted services to accept cash. And firstly, what would you say to that argument? Would you buy that argument? Do you think it is a resource issue? And secondly, how do you think central government could help local government better handle cash? So anyone who wants to start?
We've been very lazy in this country over cash acceptance. So we bring out in our submission to this committee the example of buses. London is one of the few major capitals in the world that doesn't accept cash on its buses. In New York, they brought in a fixed fare system so that cash would continue to be used. They brought that in 1969. 55 years later, cash is still accepted on New York buses. That's when people are actually thinking of the future and planning for the future. There's too little of that going on here. There's a kind of move to push cashless, and so they're not thinking about innovations. Around the world, there are innovations available in the cash world that can make cash easier for businesses and easier for the public. And we've got to see more of those innovations in this country. But they're available, we just haven't brought them in. I'll give you one example. There was a big fuss made last year. We're bringing in these super ATMs where every bank's customer can deposit cash. That's something that's been available as a linked transaction for 8 years, since 2016, but the banks never implemented it. And in other countries, every single Japanese ATM in Japan accepts cash deposits and recycles the cash. And they've been doing recycling since, I think, 1984. So in this country, hardly any ATM recycles cash. That's an innovation that makes it less expensive to operate, also means that the carbon footprint is reduced. Why isn't that more common? So the innovations are there. Let's see them made.
Rachel Blake MP.
I wanted to come back to practical solutions and whether the current framework supports people on cash acceptance, particularly around energy bills, and whether or not you've got any evidence to share on the cash payment for energy costs and whether or not people are forced into less advantageous tariffs. Is there any evidence on that? I'm just interested
I guess
in
the group of people I'm talking about, if you've got an appointee, they will be paying your energy bills for you. So there won't be an issue there in terms of being able to pay. If you're living relatively independently and actually you survive on cash, it could be very difficult if you can't pay those bills by physically going into a place and paying for your electricity by cash.
Presumably it drives people more though to meters.
Exactly.
So they're therefore on a different
Actually, you get a top up and.
So is there a way to not be on a meter tariff and still paying cash? That's my question. And if there isn't, should there be?
You can. I think this is. I hope it's not getting off topic, but you can pay your bill after you receive the bill. You can go to a pay point and make payment. Okay. However, the price cap is higher. So we had been pushing Ofgem to equalise the price caps across all forms of payments, which they did for prepayment meters, but not for credit payments. And so they sort of backed away from doing that. But that's probably a matter for Ofgem.
That's helpful. That's helpful to know. So there's still a difference.
Yeah, there is. That's right.
So credit rating will be dependent upon how often you use credit cards. So actually, if you don't use credit cards and you survive on cash, you won't have a very good credit rating, which means you won't be given a sort of electricity bill that will allow you to pay after you've used your electricity.
We've had some of our supporters come back to us and say that they resent the fact that they're being pushed into doing direct debits, and even if they are allowed to use cash, they're paying more to use cash, which they just think is not right.
Okay, thank you. We've touched quite a bit on transport, but I just wanted to talk a bit more about the transport issues that the different groups that you represent. So where you've covered it, you don't need to repeat it. But do you think that it? Well, I think Mr. Delnevo's probably said what he's got to say on this, but perhaps for some of the rest of you, do you think that there is now a big exclusion problem because people can't use cash on buses? Given that I'm in London MP, an Oyster card or a Zip card for young people is just the normal way now because there is no cash. Is that actually excluding people? And in other cities where cash is accepted,
two key things for me. Firstly, coming back to the point in terms of refreshments on trains. Now, we often bring people down from Holyhead to Cardiff to speak in the Senedd. Now that's a 5+ hour journey, and if you don't have access to a debit or credit card, you can't buy any drink. So to go for 5 hours without any drink, I think it's not very, very good for people.
Are they buying their tickets in cash?
Sorry?
Are they buying the ticket for their train?
We often will buy the ticket for them.
Okay.
So we'll send them the picture that they can use that then. But that links on to the fact that actually, Transport for Wales has moved now to fining anyone who enters a train without a ticket. Now, most of the stations are not staffed, so actually, unless you can pay for a ticket with a debit or credit card, you can't buy a ticket at a station. So what we've written to the Cabinet Secretary for Transport in Wales to ask for reassurance that actually, if you don't have the ability to pay for a ticket by cash, that you're not going to be charged and fined essentially for getting on a train without a valid ticket. So those two things are really worrying for us. So the fact that you potentially could be fined for not getting your ticket before you get on the train, but also the fact that there will be people taking very long journeys on trains in Wales and the rest of the UK where you physically won't be able to buy a coffee or a tea or a water.
And just something I'm ignorant on, I think we need to check if you don't know, which I don't expect that you necessarily would know. If you've only got cash on you and you're on a train without a ticket and you try to pay the train manager for that ticket, will they accept cash then?
My understanding is unless you have the ticket before you get on the train, you will be fined.
I know people sometimes buy extra tickets on trains. Well, we can pick that up elsewhere. Ms. McAvoy.
Just to come in on that, Chair, I think it's interesting. So my observation on what you're saying is that I think different providers might have different rules on if somebody's on the train and they've got a lot of cash and they're happy to buy a ticket. I think that's one thing. But the refreshments element, if you're with somebody who you're looking after, so for the staff member who's supporting that person, to not be able to use your card to buy them a you know, a bottle of water or a sandwich in that 5 hour, that's really a massive deterrent for those people to be able to get that journey, isn't it? So it is really, from what you've said, it's leading me to believe that it is people would not take those journeys.
No, they wouldn't, I don't think.
Thank
Or
you.
would suffer if they did, because actually they'd spend 5 hours on a train without being able to buy anything.
And I mean, another area of transport. I mean, so perhaps other people could just come in if they've got anything to say about particular fares in particular, but also access to other facilities at stations like toilets and so on. I don't know if anyone's got anything to add to that. I'll perhaps go down the line if you've got something to say. Ms. Cartwright, you've talked a bit about transport, not having money for a bus fare to escape.
Cashless toilets are becoming a thing.
Yeah.
Contactless toilets, I've noticed that travelling around. So you can't have access to the toilet unless you can use a contactless card. So.
Anyone got any other comments about access to transport?
I think what I already covered is that access to transport is really a matter of life or death for victims and survivors, and being able to flee an abuser, you won't necessarily have access to a car, so you need to get a train or a bus or a taxi to be able to leave, and if they don't accept cash, then you won't be able to do that. So it is a matter of safety for victims and survivors.
I think I'd just add
I'll go down the line then come back to you, Ms. McAvoy.
I'd just add about social exclusion, because I think that's, again, another big thing that we hear from lots of people, where you're stuck at home a lot of the time because it can be too difficult to leave the house. And if you've, again, worked yourself up to leaving, you're going somewhere that you're looking forward to, and then you're not able to pay for that transport, it can just really knock you back. And to go back to, again, the kind of the affordability point, we heard from a couple of people during the cost of living crisis, the peak, that people were just not getting buses to go to their doctor because they couldn't afford it. And it wasn't specifically because of cash, but that was the risk, that people would just get cut off from so many of these essential services that they just rely on for their health.
Well, certainly in my constituency, which is perhaps a constituency of two halves these days, there are some people who just cannot afford a bus fare, and the idea of having a £3 deposit or £5 deposit, I think it is now, on an Oyster card is just a step. You couldn't have that money sitting there not doing anything. It would be very difficult. Ms. McAvoy, you wanted to come in?
Sorry,
Chair. Thank you for that. Over to Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk a bit about the stability of the systems that support card payments, and I don't know if it's best place for you, Ron Delnevo. We've had some pretty high-profile failures in recent years. That we had the CrowdStrike incident as well. Yep. How stable is this infrastructure versus cash, would you say?
It's as stable as the men and women manning it. So when the chap who was doing the upgrade to the security in CrowdStrike made a mistake, the whole system crashed. So not very stable. And that's before you take account of the fact that there are now hackers from various parts of the world trying to destabilise the situation. So it's no accident that the Swedish government, and Sweden was meant to be cashless by now, has said that they're not going to go cashless. They've told the banks that they must handle cash again at the branches, and they've advised the Swedish public to keep cash at home because they fear, let's be honest about it, they fear Russian hackers' intervention in their payment systems. They've got some very popular digital payment systems like Swish, but if the hackers get into it, they won't work, and the whole thing could collapse if there's no substitute. And the thing about cash is it doesn't crash. If you've got it, it works.
So just to reiterate that point, you're saying that cash is a form of sort of civil preparedness and is needed as a defensive manoeuvre in the way the world is at the moment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, not just me. I was talking to Alistair Cairns, the Veterans Minister, and he told me when I spoke to him at the Labour Party conference that cash is an essential part of national security. And in this day and age, in an uncertain world, it's getting more and more uncertain. So, yeah.
And something that was said earlier on, I think it was you, Mr. Darcy, said about the pace of cash acceptance is falling away at a rate that's faster than people are being able to catch up with new tools. So let's imagine a world where we have transferred a lot of people that you're concerned about, the vulnerable people that you're representing, have made an adaptation, and then these systems fail. Could you talk through some of the consequences that might happen if people manage to learn new systems, but then those systems fail and they don't have the cash as an option?
What I could tell you is that one of the people who gave evidence to the Senate inquiry was a newsagent, and she talked often about the fact that even if you have the system, the Wi-Fi will go down, and she said you could be the whole day without the ability to take any payments then. So actually, even if you're a provider who accepts both cash and contactless or debit card, the infrastructure isn't always going to be there, so you have to mitigate for that by ensuring that you do take cash. So if you have businesses that are solely reliant, okay, people will be excluded, but also that business is fragile, because if the Wi-Fi goes down, and this shop owner was in a very tiny village in the middle of rural Powys, so she said actually to get people to come and fix it took the whole day. So that meant she had the whole day of not being able to accept any card payment.
Anyone else? No, okay. Thanks very much, Dr. Jeevan Sander, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to talk a bit about kind of if we were to transition over, who could and could not transition over, and particularly thinking about those who don't have access to a form of bank account, why that is. Mr. Brooks, can I start with you? Which kind of people, especially some of the people you're dealing with, don't have a bank account at the moment, and why is that the case?
I think it's a minority of people who don't have a bank account, but I'm not sure about the figures among older people, but certainly across society, I think there are quite a substantial minority of people that are still unbanked. I think why that's the case is difficult. For lots of people, it's because they've been in financial difficulty in the past and maybe have been declared bankrupt and are recovering. Or for some people, it's a case of being unable to open a bank account, which I think is a problem that I hear quite a bit about, actually, and increasingly, even in branches today, it can be quite difficult for someone. You can go in, the banks are very rigid about the ID they will take to open a bank account, which can make it very difficult for some people, particularly very often people on lower incomes who are much less likely to have the correct forms of ID. So that can be a significant barrier. And again, I heard recently about one bank from an older person who went into a branch of a bank and was with the correct ID, but was told they weren't able to open an account because they had to do it online, but they weren't online. So I think the practice and the rhetoric from the banks don't quite match up sometimes, and that's a particular issue. And I think those are the kind of issues that need to be addressed to really get to the root of the problem.
Yeah. Also go back to Mr. Cartwright, because I was struck with your testimony. So about 2% of the UK population doesn't have bank accounts, but some of the people that you're dealing with are the people who don't like to use bank accounts after they've experienced abuse, or during that moment. I mean, during it might be quite difficult, but afterwards, are they able to access banking, or do they feel the need to be unbanked?
I think it's both. So during the relationship, they might just be completely prevented from accessing a bank account by the abuser. It might be unsafe for them to access a bank account because of how they are tracked. Once they leave, it might be difficult for them to open a bank account because they don't have the right form of ID, either because the perpetrator has stopped them from accessing that, or because they've had to flee without those forms of ID. So it's important that there is flexibility in the identification that banks accept, so that victim survivors can more easily open a bank account. I think I also mentioned that migrant victim survivors in particular who don't have leave to remain cannot access an independent bank account. I think there's an exception around that. If you have a legitimate barrier to leaving the UK, you can access a bank account, but the Home Office hasn't defined what a legitimate barrier to leaving is. So if they are able to clarify, being a victim survivor of domestic abuse presents a legitimate barrier, then we could enable migrant victim survivors to be able to access an independent bank account as well. We know that victim survivors also sometimes are scared to then access a bank account because of the ways in which they've been controlled. One victim survivor shared after leaving that the abuser was able to have access to her bank statements following separation, possibly a part of the divorce proceedings. So therefore she didn't use her bank because she was afraid he could then find where she was. So there are many reasons why before and after they can't access a bank account.
That's very helpful, thank you. And so if we were to transition to a world that was entirely cashless, it seems like there's some regulation changes and some banking policy changes internally to ensure they do. Does anyone else in the panel want to pick up anything in particular that is holding people from opening bank accounts that you think should be changed?
I think we need to be careful as well that we don't see the bank account as the answer, because actually it's the type of bank account you're allowed to have, because you will have people, whether homeless people who may have a bank account, but actually that bank account is very limited. So all you will get is a cash point card, and you can't use any other types of transactions through that bank account other than, your benefits will go into that account and you'll be able to withdraw certain amounts of money from that bank account. You can't pay for things like direct debits, you can't use credit or debit cards. So I think we need to be careful that actually just because you have access to a bank account doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to survive in a cashless society.
Thank you.
I think one thing to say, I read that
Never.
There's so many statistics like 1.2 million people don't have bank accounts in the UK. But one does, and echoing the last point, one has to be very careful about stats like that, because how many of the accounts that are open are actually being used and can be used in a way that helps the customer. I think in India, actually, they were claiming at one stage a massive improvement in financial inclusion because of all the bank accounts. And then when they did an analysis, almost 50% of those bank accounts were never being used. So it was a mythological, if you like, an illusionary inclusion. The other thing to say, I think we need to be very careful about using the word transition here. This isn't like moving from analogue TV to digital TV. Losing cash would be a fundamental change to our society. It would affect all sorts of things like civil liberties, privacy and so on, that we need to take very great account of. And if you look at troubled parts of the world, it's interesting how people who are trying to resist, in some cases, undemocratic governments, for example, they switch back to using cash because they cannot be tracked using cash as opposed to other methods. So I don't think we should regard this as a simple technical issue of transitioning. This is a fundamental change to our society, which many believe should not happen.
Just to build on the accessibility point, if I can, we do lots of hands-on work with banks looking at their services, particularly current accounts. So we've heard less about people not being able to get accounts at all, but how well they actually work for people is a very different question. And sometimes it's really simple stuff like you are looking for help with something, might be your finances, might be your mental health, and you're trying to find the help page on their website, and it's just impossible to find because it's 5 web pages deep and there's no search box, which apparently is quite difficult to do for some firms. So there's lots of things that, to Mr. Delnevo's point, even if people have bank accounts, how much they're actually getting out of them if firms aren't thinking about how do we make sure they're really accessible and usable for everyone.
Can we just one other thing about how banks behave? The building societies are so much better. I left Lloyds Bank when they closed their branch locally and I moved to Nationwide. I went in to open my account. They said, oh, you can do it online. I said, oh, okay. And they said, but actually, if you want to, let's do it right now in the branch. That never happens in the high street banks. They opened it in a few minutes working with a customer, and that is so different from the mutuals to what's happening with the high street banks. They want you to go home and do it online, but if you haven't got access to online, as we were hearing earlier, how can you open the account? So you don't have that trouble with the building society, so we need to build up the building society movement again in this country, because it's been a sad loss, quite frankly.
A number of Labour co-op MPs around the table might well agree with you on that, but we're going to have to get into the politics of it. Dr. Sander, yeah. Siobhan McDonough MP, did you want to come back in? No. Dame Harriet?
Yes. May I?
Yes.
Just slightly flipping this whole issue on its head and thinking about the businesses that have chosen not to accept cash. And the reasons that they might have made that choice presumably are to do with the expense of handling cash. And in addition, there will be in a constituency like mine, lots of communities where the last bank has closed. And it's very hard for businesses in a situation like that to deal with their petty cash. And I just wondered whether you as a panel or individually had made any representations to the regulator or to Cash Access or to Link about how important it is for access to cash to actually have access to a bank, a physical bank as well. Anyone want to start on that one?
Yeah. I mean, I think this it strikes to the heart of the issue, because I have some sympathy with businesses in local communities when it's very difficult for them to bank their takings at the end of the day. And the reason it's difficult is because over the last 2 or 3 decades, the banks have sort of been systematically running down the cash infrastructure, largely by closing branches, which in turn makes it more expensive to deal with cash for them and for businesses, and it creates a vicious cycle where it makes it harder and harder for businesses to take cash. And so particularly when I think of small retailers, I don't think it's necessarily fair to place the burden on them for what is in effect the failings of the banking system. However, the good news, and what makes me very optimistic, is the rise of shared banking hubs, which Age UK has been involved with, and I think the sector has finally recognised that it's a very serious issue, and that if in effect it was sort of heading towards replicating what happened with cheques. When cheques were declining, the banks had an ancient processing infrastructure for cheques, and then suddenly there came a crunch point when the bank said cheques aren't viable anymore, and the government and the regulator stepped in and said you've got to maintain cheques, and then they had to put up a huge upfront investment to upgrade their infrastructure to make it possible to keep going. And so they recognised that there was a similar point approaching with cash. So they invested, they got together, they developed shared banking hubs, which were really positive. The rollout is still in its fairly early days.
On that point, which is excellent, I should elaborate on my question, because you can have a community where the last branch closes and it doesn't qualify for a banking hub because there are cash points to retake cash, but there is nowhere for the businesses to deposit cash. And so my question was, have you made representations to either the FCA, Cash Access, or
we have
about actually that is one of the fundamental things that we need from a banking hub, and that the criteria for banking hubs need to be widened to allow you to have somewhere not just where you can get cash out of a hole in the wall, but where you can, as a business, deposit your petty cash as well.
We have made
have you made those representations, any of you?
Mr. Brooks finish then.
Yeah, I'll be as brief as I can. But yes, I agree. That's a really serious issue.
Made the representation.
Yes. And I think it's recognised, and there are various issues with the system and the way it's evolved, particularly around how building societies are treated who don't do business banking, like so what's known as the nationwide block. In towns where there's a nationwide left, weren't eligible for a banking hub, and those type of issues are beginning to be addressed. So getting business banking in, and also it's absolutely crucial. And alongside banking hubs, there are also multi-bank deposit solutions being put in place. So that would be like in a supermarket where businesses can go in and deposit their takings at the end of the day. And building up the infrastructure to a point where, frankly, there will be a much more limited range of excuses for businesses not to take cash.
Please, can I ask all of you excellent advocates of this, the importance of this issue today, can I ask all of you to make formal representations by letter to those three organisations about this important point?
We have spoken to the FCA, and we've told Sheldon Mills at the FCA he'll be getting our proposals for the viability of cash going forward. And one of those proposals is to do with banking hubs. The problem we've got with banking hubs is it's great that they're open, and Natalie Sine has done a great job persuading the banks and the post office to participate, but the numbers envisaged at the moment are wholly inadequate.
And you don't qualify for a banking hub if there's an access to a cash point. So could you all please make that point?
Mr. Delnevo, you mentioned earlier about what they're doing in other countries. If you've got any evidence, nothing that's not necessarily very sophisticated, if you can point us in the direction of countries that are doing this well. I think you mentioned Japan as one example. That would be very helpful, because we may want to do some international comparisons about smart cash points, which might solve some of the points that David
make clear the numbers. We believe that 1,200 banking hubs are needed in this country, and at the moment we're talking about 350 by 2029, and that's not going to cover the country. And also these super ATMs, as they're called, they were celebrating last week, they got 50 out, and that's a good start, but they need thousands of those around the country. So, and we need an economic solution as well. If we just come up with solutions which paper over the cracks and aren't economic, then they'll fall down, and we can't have that.
But they're not in the criteria for banking hubs.
Exactly, they're not.
So please, can you all make these powerful representations?
And we have obviously our voice as a committee.
I think that's great coming from an MP. That's great, because we've been saying where is the specification of banking hubs?
Okay,
I'm glad you raised that point on air here, because we will take it up.
Lola McAvoy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Just finally, for my own understanding, I feel quite strongly that the evidence that you've given has been really powerful and leads me to conclude that there's a real need to keep cash in our society long term, but that predominantly it's people on low income, either temporarily in Ms Cartwright's examples and testimony, or permanently in some of the other testimonies that we've heard. Would you agree that it is disproportionately affecting the low-income bracket in this country, the lack of cash access?
So I would say for people, no, because we will have people with large bank accounts, but actually they don't have the mental capacity to manage accounts that allow them to have access to a debit or credit card. So there will be people who are on benefits and low income, but there are also people who will be left houses and income and legacies from their families, but they don't have the mental capacity to manage an account which will give them access to debit or credit facilities. So they will be getting access to their cash on a daily or weekly basis via an ATM card. Or, I mean, we still hear stories where people go down to, if the local authority is the appointee, they go down and collect their envelope of cash for the week from the local authority. Physically, they go down and they get an envelope for £100, and that's their cash for the week.
Anyone else, Mr. Brooks? I think some of you covered this a bit in your other areas. Anything to add, I should say?
I think
Ms. Cartwright.
Victims, survivors of economic abuse won't necessarily be low income. They may have assets, they may have money which they cannot access, which is why they're dependent on cash. They oftentimes will be temporarily low income, but that's not necessarily the case.
I think that 81%, as I said earlier, told Link that they want the option to use cash, and that must cover every income group in the country, and it's important, want, not just need. They want to use cash. It's a preference.
Mr. Brooks.
I think being on a low income is probably the strongest factor that connects a lot of people that do want to or need to use cash, but it's obviously not the only factor, if that makes sense.
I think with those FCA stats, again, it looks around like you're twice as likely to use cash if you're on a lower income and have low financial resilience. But there's also people, as I mentioned, who might have more money saved up, but in a bad period can really blow through it, and having cash is a protection for them.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Now, can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for what's been a really...
Would it be all right if there's increasing alienation from politics and the system and stuff. And one of the conspiracy theories, which seems to be, in great currency, is that the government is determined to, any government, irrespective of party, government is determined to make us a cashless society. Do we need to challenge that conspiracy theory by enabling the use of cash or easier use of cash?
There is no conspiracy going on. There's a plan that commercial organisations have in place that they're operating, and the public interest is not being served. So the government, yes, need to make clear that they will look after the public interest, and if they're looking after the public interest, they will make sure this is not a cashless society, that cash is available and usable.
Well, for the record, both last and this government, both chancellors, the Chancellor and the previous Chancellor and the current Chancellor, have said access to cash is important, but cash is often controlled by, as you say, private sector bodies. So quite an interesting point there. Mr. Brooks.
I don't think there's a conspiracy, but I think the government can help with its communication and the way it talks about cash just by making it absolutely clear that cash is here to stay and it's not going to go away. And I think as long as that message can get across to the public, I think people will understand that there isn't a conspiracy. And I don't think it's commercial organisations in the round. There might be some commercial organisations that want that, but it's not most commercial organisations.
Well, definitely not. Definitely not. The major retailers in this country support cash, so it's not a problem with them. But there are some organisations who would be suited by a cashless society.
Even within the banking sector, there's a lot of difference in policy and practice and approach to these issues.
Yeah, the building societies are great.
Okay, well, listen, another advert. There we go. Okay, can I just say thank you again for what we've heard. It's been very illuminating. And do feel free if you would like to add anyone. I know some of you put in evidence already, but if there's more you would like to add, this is going to be ongoing for a few months. And again, I say that to others who may be watching. We've had hundreds of pieces of evidence so far. Not everyone needs to repeat it. They might want to read what's online before they deluge our amazing staff team with more. But we've heard today a lot about whether policymakers do or not understand how a lack of cash acceptance can deprive people of goods, services, and also just the ability to use cash as part of their lives. And that there is a real danger that the unmanaged decline of cash is excluding people, and that there may be equalities issues here. I think some very powerful testimony, Ms. Cartwright, about the people who are in that temporary space, we hope a temporary space, where they're controlled, which I think hasn't come up often in some of the inquiries that Parliament has done. And that cash acceptance is actually critical, as you've all demonstrated, for particular vulnerable groups in society, which you have ably represented here today. And it's a passport to participation for everybody, which I think we've heard really clearly from you. So can I thank you very much indeed for your time. As I say, we will be continuing with this inquiry. We'll keep you in the loop and make sure you have an early sight of our report. I say early, I'm going to be careful about it, not too early, before the clerk tells me off. You'll get sight of the report, of course, and the transcript for this session will be available on the website, uncorrected, in the next couple of days, and with great thanks to our colleagues at Hansard for that. Can I thank you very much indeed?
Thank you.